Okay, this is the wind down video that I promised. I know my hair looks a fright. I actually did a 33-minute video last night and then lost it, trying to get rid of, I don't know what it is, a burst of pictures. But anyway, never mind that. First order of business, I have to apologize for not being able to change horses in midstream, as the saying goes. I wish I was better at Facebook, but I had really no experience with it. And from one day to the next, that was supposed to happen. It didn't. I know some of you, I would feel cheated out of, half a semester or 2/3 of a semester or whatever it was. I am going, in the fall, we'll probably be doing everything online. And I'm going to see about, if anybody wants to, they can maybe audit my online class when we start up in the fall. And then you'll get, I know the U.S. class I got to the beginning of the 20th century, and in the world history class we got just to that second wave of imperialism in the late 19th century. The 20th century is really the story. I sometimes think history should be taught backwards. Start with today and go backwards. I'm struggling to get the grading done. I've got a lot of it done, very little left to do. The problem is a lot of people emailed me papers, and a lot of people, there was the 06 class, I think, gave me a lot of papers as hard copy. And I haven't figured out or found out how to post those grades. The people that got grades in Blackboard, I graded the papers and they posted the grades. Okay, some people submitted papers twice, in which case I graded the first one or I graded the second one. I don't really know what order they came in. And then in order to move on, I had to give a grade to the second paper. The grade I gave was generally a 0, but it won't affect your grade overall. It's just a way of getting that to move on. There's probably a better way to do it that I don't know yet. I'm figuring all of this out as we go along, okay? And on the subject of grades and points, I know it seems like the most important thing in the world to you right now, and it probably is. Okay, if you want to go to transfer to a 4-year school, you got to have a GPA. If you graduate with a bachelor's degree and want to go to graduate school, you have to have a good GPA. That's true. On the other hand, if you graduate with a bachelor's degree and go get a job someplace, within 2 years, nobody's going to really care whether you got a B+ or an A- in introductory psychology. It's just not going to matter to anybody. Yeah. I was moving some stuff around. And I came across my not the official copy of my transcript, but a transcript from Brooklyn College, and in the around December, January of 1994, I just walked off the campus. I didn't withdraw. I didn't, do it officially. I just walked off. I thought to myself, I'll take a semester off. I'll get a job. I'll make some money, and I'll come back. And that took about 11 years for me to get back. But I was taking 5 courses that semester. I got C's in 2 of them. The teachers were sort of merciful. And then F's in the other 3. You'd think that would wreck your GPA forever, When I went back in 1985, I was now sober. I was an older man. I had experiences, and I was a little driven. And I just got A's all the way through, as far as I could tell, and graduated the second one, summa cum laude, with honors in history. And but grades are not the definition of who you are, Well, I've taught some at Binghamton University. I've taught some as a teaching assistant. I did grading as a teaching assistant. And I actually had classes of my own. I actually taught a class that had about 125 students in it. I had 3 graduate assistants underneath me, okay? It was the Holocaust class, and they needed somebody to do it, so I did it. Up at BU, I wouldn't give out a B+, because a B+ was just an invitation to come argue with me for the A-, you know? Like, an A- looks so much better than a B+. So what I would do is, the people that ended up with a B+, I would just look at it and say, if they were on the low end of it, I'd make it a B, and if they were on the high end of it, I'd make it an A-. And then there were no arguments. People are not going to argue to make a B into a B+, and they're happy with an A-. I don't need the Zurus, a Yiddish word. Okay. The thing I'm trying to get at, I think, is this: that if you approach all of your classes, you know, I know you have to take a world history class. You're not the least bit interested in world history, perhaps. Pretend that you are. Pretend that it's the most fascinating thing you've ever come across. And if you approach it that way, and you do as much of the reading as you can, and you, you know, get interested, the grades will follow. You will get, you know, but if you're constantly worried about, oh, did I lose 7 points there? That's not a way to learn. That's a way to, I don't know, win a horse race or something like that. Right? Now, I know we kind of cut off in the middle of stuff, and I haven't been very good at getting stuff up and, you know, finding videos that were appropriate and made sense. But I do have a couple of suggestions, all right? Some for the U.S. history class and some for the world history class. For the U.S. history class, this is called The People's History of the United States, 1492 to the present, and it's by Howard Zinn. This happens to be the 20th anniversary edition. It's hardcover, it's gigantic. It was a gift to me from a guy that's now passed on, that it was a pretty important guy to me, all right? And he was in the bookstore, and he knew I was teaching history, and he got it for me. It's a very left-wing version of U.S. history, but there's a lot of stuff in here that you won't get in other history textbooks, you know? For the most part, history textbooks tend to be, you know, supportive of the system and not critical, you're not highly critical of the system. This is a highly critical work, okay? And it covers, you know, 1492 to the present, so you might want to jump in at, you know, the Civil War part, okay? There's that. And then there's this, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Now, I bought this because my son, who's 28 and is teaching in Queens at a middle school, suggested I get it. And I haven't read it all, but just the first couple of chapters, it's like looking at American history from the Native American point of view, which shifts everything, you know, it just shifts everything. It's like the Europeans are advancing westward, pioneers, you know, and the Native Americans are on the other side getting pushed. So they're going to have two different stories, you know. It's things about settlers and land, it highlighted all that. And while we're on the subject, and this is probably important for world history students as well. The New York Times last August 2019, started a thing called the 1619 Project. Okay, 1619 was the year that the first Africans were sold into Jamestown, into North America. Okay. Slavery had been built up 100 years earlier in Brazil and the Caribbean colonies, okay, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. But there was like 24, 25 Africans brought to Jamestown by a Dutch ship and deposited there. And what the 1619 Project is trying to do, like Native American history, the indigenous people's history, is shift the viewpoint so that slavery becomes as important as it should be and is. You know, it's a different way of looking at American history. My summer class has been canceled. That was going to be 1:30, the first half of U.S. history, and in that class I do a lot more talking. But we know everybody that comes up who's from the South. I ask somebody to look up on their phone, on their device, how many slaves they owned, and it's amazing. A whole bunch of presidents owned slaves. Some of them owned enormous numbers of slaves, it seems to me. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Tyler, Polk, Taylor. I'm leaving out some. Jackson. They all owned slaves. But not only the presidents. Famous senators and congressmen and justices of the Supreme Court, and there was like a whole power structure of people that owned slaves. They were the elite in the South, So that was that. I'm waiting on a copy of the August New York Times magazine because I thought I was going to teach a summer course and I was going to use that, but not going to happen. Okay. In the world history class, I don't have a book to throw out, but you really have to try to understand imperialism as a development of capitalism, another way of going forth with capitalism, and this whole process of colonizing parts of the world, Africa and Asia. Okay, going in, basically imposing your civilization on another civilization. Okay, and the resistance that takes place. Okay, by 1900, most of the world is either Europe or countries like Canada and the United States that are sort of Western European derived, or they are colonies. Thailand is independent, but only because the British and the French on either side don't want it to be, they don't want to fight over it. They want a buffer state. And in Africa, Ethiopia is independent because they were able to beat back the Italians in 1896. But every place else has been colonized. And you have to try to understand what that process means. Changes in law, in religion, in dress, in culture, all these things, okay? And then the 20th century becomes a long process of these countries getting their independence one way or another, sometimes violently, sometimes peaceful. I like to think it starts with the Irish in 1916. Ireland is the Britain's earliest colony. And a lot of people cut it, don't count it because it's not the third world, it's not outside of Europe. But, it starts in 1916, and by the mid-20s, I think, at least the southern part of Ireland is independent and free. The real push is after World War II. And the reason it succeeds, basically, is because England and France can no longer afford to maintain these colonies. And then you have resistance, people like Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, the Algerian freedom fighters. Just all over the world there are people pushing against this kind of imperialism, pushing for independence for these different countries. And that's an important process. Okay? The 20th century is a whole, that's really the heart of the matter. Like, how did we get here, you know? Big wars, these independence movements, the civil rights movement in the United States, which sparks a whole number of things. In the United States, the African Americans pushing for their civil rights leads to a rebirth of feminism, and then a gay rights movement. And then overseas, it's the civil rights movement in the United States that sparks things in Ireland, where in the Protestant part of Ireland, the Catholics are sort of kept down as second-class citizens, and they sort of take that Martin Luther King and those things as their inspiration. Okay? All of this comes together kind of in, how much time am I using? 16 minutes, all right. All of this kind of comes together in the story of Vietnam and the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And so I want to run that down. This is for the U.S. students and the world history students. Okay? Vietnam is colonized by the French in the 1860s. And not just Vietnam, but Cambodia and Laos are also, it's French Indochina is what they call it. The French introduce Catholicism, the French language, Western forms of dress, probably Western forms of music, I'm not 100% sure. All of these things, okay? And they exploit it economically. I think what Vietnam has is rubber trees, or what Indochina has is rubber trees. And but I'm not sure about that. I know when the Vietnam War was raging, people went out of their way to try to find an economic motive for that. And there really wasn't one at that point. We were using synthetic rubber and, but maybe the French were using natural rubber. Doesn't matter. So the French are there from 1860, 40 years to 1900, and another 40 years to when the Japanese kicked them out. Okay? While there's a guy that leads the struggle against the United States in Vietnam, and his name is Ho Chi Minh, but that's a pseudonym. A student one time gave me his real name on a piece of paper, written down on a piece of paper, but I don't know where it is. You could look it up. Somebody get their phone out and look it up, and email me. Ho Chi Minh is an interesting character because what the imperialists would do is pick out really smart, promising, indigenous people, okay? And bring them to France or bring them to England and educate them and sort of really try to get, the imperialist point of view inside their heads. It doesn't really work. Gandhi goes off to England. I don't know if he studies at Oxford or Cambridge or whatever school. He becomes a lawyer. And then he goes back they send him to South Africa, and he gets involved in civil rights for Indian people in South Africa, and then eventually goes back to India and leads a whole independence movement. Ho Chi Minh does the same thing, but he goes to Paris. He studies at the Sorbonne, very famous university in Paris. And then he goes on to Moscow, I guess becomes a communist, and then goes back to Vietnam, okay? He's in Vietnam when the Japanese come in and throw the French out. In fact, he works with the United States during the war years to sort of pass information on about the Japanese troop movements and stuff like that, okay, from the inside. After the war, of course, the Japanese are defeated. the atom bombs get dropped. And people like Ho Chi Minh are thinking, well, the French are gone, the Japanese are gone, we should be independent. But the United States actually pushes France to go back into Indochina and maintain their colonial hold on that place. And the French basically say, well, you know, we don't really have the money for that. We can't afford that. We just finished World War II and took everything out of us, you know? So the United States actually paid the soldiers' salary, the French soldiers' salary. The French Foreign Legion was paid by the United States to go back in. And why would the United States do that? Well, the situation after World War II was such that you had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay? Now, the Soviet Union had suffered great damage during World War II, 20 million dead, and railroads torn up, and factories bombed, and all that kind of stuff. The United States was only hit once, Pearl Harbor, out in the middle of the Pacific. It's hardly even a part of the United States, but it is a part of the United States. Germany is in ashes, you know. Japan is in, Tokyo's been burned to, you know, firebombed to smithereens. Dresden in Germany is firebombed to smithereens. Berlin is completely flattened. Hamburg, other cities in Japan. England had been bombed early on in the war by the Germans. France was taken over by the Germans. It's fighting in Italy, you know, all over the place. So America is basically the only intact manufacturing power, industrial power. Okay? But they're very wary of the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, during the war years, the United States, in order to carry out the war effort, to build all those tanks and planes and ships and uniforms and bombs and guns and machine guns and cannon and, you know, howitzers, and it goes on and on and on. Helmets, you know, medical supplies, K rations, you know. In order to supply all that stuff to the soldiers overseas, the United States has to expand its capacity to produce things. And in fact, it does that about 4 times. There's like 4 times as much stuff being produced in 1945 than there was in 1940 or 41. Okay? Now, when you're producing that much stuff, you have to, in capitalism, you have to sell that much stuff. And so that's a concern. You can't, two concerns. You can't stop military spending. Right? They did that at the end of World War I. They just cut off military spending when the war ended, and there was a depression or a recession in 1919, 1920. So they don't want to do that. And then they're concerned about where are we going to sell all this stuff that we can produce. I'm sure we can sell a lot of it here, but we have to sell a lot of it overseas. And the Soviet Union is accused of, I gotta watch the time. The Soviet Union is accused of having expansionist tendencies. That's its whole policy of containment. But really, all they really want physically is that buffer in Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. You know, they were attacked in World War I. They were attacked in 18 whatever with Napoleon, and they were attacked in 1941 by the Germans under Hitler. So they want control of those countries, and they managed to get it. You know, there's a big argument over Poland. There's a London Polish government in exile. There's a Lublin, Polish government in exile that's in the Soviet Union. Stalin wins the argument because his tanks are already there, right? So the United States is a little concerned about the spread of communism, and that's why we kind of asked the French to go back into Vietnam, and we're willing to pay for it, okay? This whole thing about the domino theory and containment. Containment is an idea that we can sort of keep this this ideology, communism, from spreading. And the only other things that I've ever heard the word containment used with are diseases like COVID-19, you want to contain it, or wildfires. You'll get reports in the summer, some parts of the world, some parts of the United States, the wildfires in Washington are 35% contained. Okay? But communism isn't like a disease or like a wildfire. It's an ideology. It's, it spreads through words and people talking to one another and people just figuring out for themselves that this is the way to go. For a lot of people in the third world, their criticism or their resistance to imperialism will lead them eventually, or sometimes eventually, to socialism or communism or something like that. So the idea is that you can't let communism spread. And it does spread. It spreads from this, the ideology spreads to China. 1949, China goes communist. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party take over China. Where else does it spread to? In 1959, Castro takes over in Cuba, and that's seen as a very threatening thing. And then the Russians put missiles in there. It's a very tense period, very tense. But that's the deal. You have to try to figure out this whole struggle between the first world imperialists and the resistance in the other countries, in the third world countries. And finally, there's this one thing that I want to get into. I read an article the other day from Politico, and I was hearing Donald Trump using the term invisible enemy in regard to the coronavirus. And I have a pretty good memory for, things like this. And I was like, where have I heard that before? Invisible enemy, invisible enemy. Well, it turns out it's a term used in the 50s to describe communist subversives in the United States. Okay? Now, there were real communists in the United States. Not a whole lot of them, but there were some. But there was also this imaginary thing, this imaginary understanding that everybody was a communist. Your teacher, your priest, the bishop. Who else? Hollywood film writers, songwriters, folk musicians, banjo players. He's a communist. And people on the right would refer to this communist subversion as the invisible enemy. And the article I read in Politico was keeping track of how many times Trump has used this term recently, and it's a lot. It's just a lot. And you could look it up. And I was thinking, what does that mean? Is he aware of the connection to the 50s? Did someone explain to him that you can tap into this Cold War mentality? I don't know. But if we had, if I was more equipped with Blackboard, I would have turned this course into a seminar on the COVID-19 pandemic, and the response to it. Okay, and that would have been a pissa. That would have been fun. Okay. Now the last thing, I usually play my harmonica for most of my classes. I've done it for a couple of the classes, I think, this week, this year, this semester. But I didn't have time. I ran out. I do have a SoundCloud page. You can hear plenty of harmonica on that SoundCloud page. There's also some bluegrass music with me playing banjo. And there's also some cuts where I play pedal steel. This is the pedal steel. I don't know, can you see it? You can't see it. Maybe I'll show it to you later. There's a pedal steel back there. It's a guitar that lays flat. It's got 10 strings. And never mind, don't worry. But I did want to play some harmonica for you, all right? You know what, though? I need a drink of water. Hang on. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Discuss. There we go. I also want to blow my nose. I won't do that on screen. Now, if you're not interested in fun stuff, you can just leave now. The harmonica is designed, it's called the diatonic harmonica, and it's designed to play sort of German music, music. It was invented in Austria or Germany, nobody really knows. So you'd play stuff like this. You know, you march into Poland playing that kind of stuff. It gets to the United States, the harmonica. This happens to be a B-flat harmonica. So the scale that's built in is a B-flat scale. So the E-flat is built in, okay? Some of you musicians will understand this. Others won't. When it gets to the United States, people play it that way, you know? But other people start to play it differently. They start taking a B-flat harmonica and playing it in F, playing it against the chords from the key of F. And this is partly an influence of African Americans because you get a kind of blues tonality there. And then they learn to bend notes, to change the notes that are actually on here, you know? You can get different notes. Those are not built in. You're doing something to the reeds. I don't know if it's actual bending, but and anyway, that's the harmonica takes off from there. Okay, and it's very different. It's called if you're playing in the key of the harmonica, it's first position. If you're playing in that other key, it's second position, and the other position. Not important. But I do want to play a little harmonica for you. Okay. I will get the grading finished. I will post them if I can. If not, you can send me an email and I will tell you what your grade is. I'd be glad to do that. If over the summer you have any questions about anything, history, I know a lot of stuff. I've been through a lot of stuff. Be safe. Wear your mask when you go out to the price chopper, please. You might not die from this stuff, but an old fuck like me may, you know? So wear your mask and wash your hands, okay? Don't worry, all right? Have a good summer. Have as good a summer as you can, given the circumstances, all right? And I'll see you on the campus, as we used to say.